The ground beneath Naples has risen more than 140 centimeters since 2005, and it has not stopped rising. In February of this year alone, monitoring stations recorded 70 earthquakes in a single week beneath the town of Pozzuoli. Scientists studying the data believe the caldera underneath more than 500,000 people may be approaching a mechanical threshold they've been watching. For since the unrest first began, one that previous crises never actually reached. To understand why researchers are treating this moment differently, it helps to place it directly next to the crises that came before it. Campi Flegrei is not new to unrest. This 8-mile-wide caldera, formed by eruptions roughly 39,000 and 15,000 years ago, has a documented history of intermittent uplift and seismic activity stretching back through the 1950s, the 1970s, and a major episode in the early 1980s. Each of those earlier crises followed a familiar shape. The ground rose, earthquakes increased, residents grew anxious, and then, over months or a couple of years, the activity subsided. After the 1982 to 1984 unrest specifically, the caldera actually sank back down by roughly 3 feet as pressure released from below. The pattern, historically, has been one of rising tension followed by relief. That 1982 to 1984 episode is worth pausing on because contemporary accounts from the scientists who lived through it capture something the raw seismic numbers don't. Researchers at the time described the social and economic toll of those 2 years of uplift as comparable to that of an actual eruption, even though no eruption occurred, and spoke openly about the accumulated psychological stress of being responsible for the safety of tens of thousands of residents, while genuinely uncertain how the crisis would resolve. That detail matters for the comparison, because it establishes that even Campi Flegrei's resolved historical crises were never actually low stakes. They were prolonged, uncertain, and genuinely difficult to manage, even in versions that ultimately subsided without incident. The similarities between then and now are real and worth stating plainly before getting into what's different. Both then and now, the mechanism driving the uplift is what volcanologists call Bradyseism, a slow, breathing-like rise and fall of the ground, caused by pressure from magma, water, and gas shifting beneath the surface. Both then and now, the activity has been concentrated in the same specific area, clustered beneath Pozzuoli and the Agnano district. Both then and now, the response has involved intensive monitoring, public anxiety, and Italian civil protection authorities tracking the situation closely enough to maintain contingency plans for the surrounding population. If the comparison stopped there, this year's unrest would look like simply another chapter in a decades-long, ultimately survivable pattern, the kind of story Naples has absorbed before and would likely absorb again. That's exactly where the comparison starts breaking down, and it's the reason scientists are treating this differently than they treated the crises of the 20th century. Here's the key difference, and it's mechanical rather than emotional. Volcanologist Christopher Kilburn at University College London has been explicit about what separates this period of unrest from the ones before it. Every previous emergency, he explains, stretched the caldera's crust a little further, and each new episode of unrest has been building directly on top of the damage, left behind by the last one, rather than starting from a fully reset baseline. That distinction matters enormously. The 1950s crisis stressed a relatively intact crust. The 1970s crisis stressed a crust already weakened by the 1950s. The 1980s crisis stressed a crust weakened further still. And this ongoing unrest, underway continuously since 2005, is stressing a crust that has now absorbed cumulative damage across 70s, years of repeated episodes, rather than a single fresh crisis working on undamaged rock. Think of it the way engineers think about metal fatigue, rather than a single overload event. A piece of metal bent back and forth repeatedly can eventually fail at a stress level far below what would have broken it the very first time, because each bend leaves microscopic damage that the next bend builds on. Kilburn's framing suggests Campi Flegrei's crust may be behaving in a broadly similar way across geological rather than mechanical timescales, with each 20th century crisis functioning less like an isolated event and more like one more cycle of stress applied to a structure that never fully returns to its original condition. That compounding effect is precisely what a new analysis, published as a preprint this year, set out to quantify directly. Researchers modeling the mathematical shape of the current acceleration found something specific, and to them, concerning. The pattern of increasing seismicity and ground deformation fits what's called a regularized finite-time singularity far better than it fits simple, exponential growth. In plainer terms, exponential growth means things get faster and faster, but theoretically continue indefinitely along the same curve. A finite-time singularity implies something different, that the current trajectory is mathematically heading toward a specific critical point, a threshold, rather than just continuing to intensify without a defined destination. The research team behind that analysis, publishing under lead author David Zaccagnino, alongside collaborators including Didier Sornet, a physicist known for applying this exact mathematical framework to systems ranging from earthquake prediction to financial market crashes, arrived at their conclusion using both geochemical evidence and statistical modeling of the deformation data itself. Their interpretation is that deep magmatic volatile input, gas and fluid rising from depth, is what's progressively pressurizing the crust from below, functioning as the underlying driver behind both the accelerating seismicity and the accelerating uplift showing up at the surface. Independent analyses converged on that critical time frame landing somewhere between 2030 and 2034, with total uplift projected to reach approximately 4 meters by the early 2030s if the current rate holds. That single projected number, 4 meters, is worth comparing directly against the historical record because it's the detail that turns abstract modeling into something concrete. The deformation this trajectory points toward would exceed anything recorded during the 20th century's unrest episodes, all of them combined, not just individually. Like and subscribe if you want science like this broken down clearly, comparing what's happening right now against the full historical record, because that context is exactly what separates informed concern from unnecessary panic. It's critical to be precise here about what crossing this kind of modeled threshold would actually mean, because it does not automatically mean eruption. Researchers studying Campi Flegrei have been explicit that reaching a critical mechanical threshold could resolve in more than one way. It could mean an eruption. It could mean what's called a bradyseismic peak, essentially the ground uplift reaching a maximum point before beginning to subside again, the way earlier crises eventually did, just from a much higher starting point than any previous episode. Or it could mean the system shifts into an entirely different behavioral regime that current models can't fully specify yet. All three outcomes remain genuinely on the table, and the researchers behind this analysis were careful not to present eruption as the presumed or most likely result. That uncertainty is echoed by scientists working on the opposite side of the problem, the ones trying to understand what's actually driving the pressure buildup in the first place. A separate research effort, using laboratory experiments, examined the caprock, the geological lid sitting above Campi Flegrei's geothermal reservoir, and found that this layer has self-healing properties that seal the system into a closed loop, allowing pressure, the kind of deformation and seismicity being recorded now. Understanding that sealing mechanism matters because it opens a genuinely different kind of comparison, one against engineered intervention rather than just historical unrest. If a closed, self-sealing caprock is what's trapping pressure and driving this cycle, researchers studying the mechanism suggest that carefully managed venting could, in theory, offer a way to relieve pressure gradually rather than have it build toward whatever the natural threshold turns out to be. Now here's where it's worth being honest about the limits of everything described so far. No monitoring network on Earth, including the extensive GPS and seismic array Italy's Osservatorio Vesuviano maintains across Campi Flegrei, can currently tell you with confidence whether this system will erupt, subside, or transition into some other state, nor can it tell you exactly when a threshold, if reached, would actually be crossed. The 2030 to 2034 window is a modeled projection built from the current trajectory continuing roughly as observed, not a guaranteed timeline. Volcanic systems have a well-documented history of accelerating, stalling, and reversing in ways that break even carefully built models, and researchers studying Campi Flegrei are explicit that this remains one of the most genuinely difficult systems on Earth to forecast with precision, specifically because it's a wide caldera rather than a single vent volcano, meaning activity could theoretically emerge at multiple points across a broad area rather than from one predictable location. Current conditions, as of this year, remain measured rather than acute. Ground uplift is continuing at roughly 10 millimeters per month, a steady but gradual rate, and earthquake activity, while elevated compared to background levels, consists overwhelmingly of small magnitude events rather than the kind of large rupture that would signal an imminent crisis. In the last week of February alone, roughly 70 earthquakes were recorded, dropping to around 47 the following week, a pattern of fluctuating but sustained activity rather than a single runaway spike. Italian civil protection has maintained a yellow or attention level alert rather than escalating further, and officials have been explicit publicly that no eruption is considered imminent under current conditions. Naples and the surrounding Campi Flegrei area remain functioning, populated, and, according to the same authorities monitoring the unrest, safe to live in and visit under the present alert level. So what does comparing this unrest to the historical record actually mean for the roughly 500,000 to 1 million people living in or around the Caldera today? The clearest, most actionable takeaway from decades of Italian civil protection planning is familiarity with the region's evacuation zoning, specifically which color-coded risk zone your home or workplace falls into, since the response plan covering the area is built around exactly that kind of pre-established zoning rather than improvised evacuation in the moment. If you live locally, know your designated evacuation route, and, where offered, participate in periodic civil protection drills, since these are specifically designed around this Caldera's documented behavior rather than generic disaster planning. Keep basic emergency supplies, including water, any needed medication, and a battery-powered radio, accessible year-round rather, then only during periods of heightened seismic activity, given that this system has shown it can shift its intensity over a matter of weeks. It's also worth having a specific, agreed-upon communication plan with family members who live or work in different parts of the Caldera zone, since the region's history of rapid seismic swarms means conditions in one district can shift meaningfully faster than in another just a few kilometers away. And if you're simply visiting the region, checking the current Italian civil protection alert level before travel takes only a few minutes and reflects the same real-time data researchers are using to track this unrest as it develops. Campi Flegrei has crossed anxious moments before and settled back down every single time, across the 1950s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. What's different this time, according to the researchers who've spent 2 decades watching it, is not the shape of any single earthquake or any single meter of uplift. It's that this crisis is building directly on the accumulated damage of every crisis before it, on a mathematical curve that, for the first time, appears to be heading toward a defined threshold rather than another gradual return to calm. Whether that threshold means eruption, a new record peak followed by subsidence, or something researchers haven't fully modeled yet, remains the open question, and it's exactly the question scientists have been watching the system for since 2005. Every earlier chapter of this Caldera's modern history ended the same way, tension building, then slowly releasing. The mathematics behind this year's data is the first real evidence that this particular chapter might not follow that same script. And that's precisely why the researchers who've tracked this system for 2 decades are watching it more closely now than at any point since the monitoring began.